Last year was extraordinary. What comes next is the question. COVID-19 rocked the world. Great power competition continued unabated, and the development of technology continued to accelerate. CHACR's Global Analysis Conference brought together some of the finest minds in the world. They discussed the events of the last 12 months, what might come next, and the implications for the army. This synopsis of our conference will only touch the wave tops of the analysis, but hopefully it will whet your appetite to dive into some of the panellists' videos. We'll break these wave tops down into 3 themes that emerged over the day. We'll look at the impact of COVID, then competition, and finally the role of technology. First, COVID-19. We are entering a period of vaccination politics. As countries scramble to inoculate their populations, world leaders must be bold in advocating the swift vaccination of the developing world. Failure to do so risks allowing COVID-19 to mutate, causing more people to die and putting greater pressure on the world economy.
The economics has been handled so far by just taking on more and more debt. And with interest, and as long as interest rates are low, this becomes manageable. In the UK, the cost of interest payments on debt has gone down, despite the fact that we've taken on hundreds of billions of extra debt, because it's acquired at very limited cost. But at some point, because of inflation or whatever, that's not going to be sustainable. So there's an economic reckoning that will come, and economic reckonings tend to be pretty traumatic in terms of political turbulence as well. When that will come, I don't know, but it will come at some point.
As countries struggle to balance their economies against green initiatives, we continue plunging into the climate crisis. Both climate change and the economy will drive populations to move, which can create increased instability. Next, we'll look at competition. Russia is declining, China is rising, and the US remains the most powerful country in the world. You could be fooled into thinking not much has changed in recent years, and on the surface, you might be right. But below the threshold of war, China and Russia constantly compete with the US and other Western countries in an attempt to redefine the world order.
In the immediate term ahead, we're unlikely to see China willingly initiate a large-scale kinetic conflict. More likely, from my opinion, is that the PRC will continue to act under the threshold of conflict in order to achieve its core objectives. And this is in a political, military, and of course, economic and other sense.
On the other hand, Russia's approach has been to insert itself into situations that forces the US to engage with it. They have had some limited success in both Ukraine and Syria, but have now inextricably fixed themselves in both countries without an obvious face-preserving exit strategy. President Biden hails a new era for the world, and while he will face some pressure from inside his own party to remain hawkish on Russia, he also offers the opportunity to warm up relations between the two countries. Biden's desire to extend START by 5 years is likely to be met with approval in Russia, in part because it signifies the importance of Russia, but also because it preserves Russia's sizable tactical nuclear arsenal.
The Russian Foreign Ministry emphasized its longstanding position, the position that they had unveiled to the Trump administration, which is that they favor also extending the treaty. Now, just not to get into too many technical details concerning this treaty, but broadly speaking, it imposes central limits on the strategic nuclear forces of the United States and Russia. It doesn't cover things like missile defenses or non-strategic nuclear weapons, which Russia has quite a few of.
President Biden will also have to deal with the proliferation of nuclear weapons in North Korea and Iran. These two countries are at very different stages of developing their nuclear capabilities, and so will require very different approaches. The difficulties of dealing with Iran are nested within the complexities of the Middle East. Jasmine El-Gamal highlighted two key rivalries that will play out in the region over the next year.
One is between the GCC and Turkey. And when I say the GCC, I really mean the UAE and Saudi Arabia. So I'll just focus on those two for now. And then, of course, the GCC and Iran. So those are two sets of relationships that we're going to be watching very closely, and that we should be watching very closely insofar as they impact not just those two countries or those two actors, the GCC and Iran and Turkey respectively, but also the way that rivalry plays out and will continue to play out in other areas of the region that are strategically important to the UK, the US, and the West in general.
The character of alliances is evolving. Trump's skepticism of NATO led the Europeans to question their reliance on the US.
The EU will continue to depend on the United States for its security. At the same time, though, it wants to be able to oppose the United States in other areas of policy, particularly economic policy. The idea that you can kind of basically have it both ways. And so I think the big question for the transatlantic relationship is going to be whether the Biden administration will allow the EU to have it both ways.
The UK's part in this is complex.
We were developing towards the end of the Trump administration quite an interesting dialogue with the Americans about the idea of selective interdependence. The US and the UK sitting down together on a systematic basis and saying across the theatres, what do we both need to be doing? When is it a question of doing it together? When is it a question of doing it separately and sharing the burden a bit like that?
In the final section of this synopsis, we'll look at the role of technology.
All technological advantage is very transitory, particularly these days. And, you know, throughout history, all new technologies have had counters very quickly. It's really about the ideas and the organisations which we put around new technologies that will give us advantage, and people are at the heart of all those things.
So in some sense, nothing has changed. People remain our most important asset. Nevertheless, tech is changing the battlefield and how actors compete below the threshold. Civilian companies develop technology rapidly and have driven down the costs of them. This has seen an increased proliferation of smaller systems. Ulrike Franke highlighted three key trends associated with drones.
Three trends that I think are worth noting and I want to talk about a little bit. And that is, first, the use of smaller drones that we're seeing. Second, the proliferation of drones. And then third, the use of more autonomous systems.
If you are interested in drones, I highly recommend watching Ulrike's presentation from the conference. She goes into more detail on each of these trends. The UK has been at the fore of operationalising drone swarms, but competition does not sleep. China has focused on developing AI to support mobilisation and logistics. While states and non-state actors alike have exploited tech in areas where our policies are still underdeveloped. We are catching up to the curve, but we are not there yet. COVID, competition, and tech. These three themes ran through all panels at CHACR's Global Analysis Conference. The question for the UK is what to do about them. The stakeholders of the integrated review are well versed in these issues. Indeed, many of them attended and some spoke at the conference. To better understand the government's approach to the IR, I highly recommend Samantha Job's presentation.